He was just the janitor invisible in the hallways of power. She was the CEO, distant, untouchable, and drowning in silence, and the boy between them. He hadn't spoken a single word in years, but one ordinary morning, in a building full of glass and noise, something unexpected happened, and none of them would ever be the same again. It started with the sound of shoes. Not just any shoes, but the sharp rhythmic clack of stilettos slicing through polished marble, echoing with authority down the 37th floor of Lancaster Industries. A floor where no one ever paused, no one ever whispered, and certainly no one ever noticed the janitor. Mark Dawson bent over his mop, wringing out the last bit of water with slow, practiced care. He didn't look up. He never did. Not when executives swept by in tailored suits, not when assistants barked into headsets, and definitely not when Arden Lancaster herself strode past with a look that could freeze a summer storm. Mark didn't mind. Being invisible had its benefits. Until today. Until the moment a child's scream shattered the glass and steel silence of the top floor. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a cry for attention. It was pure, unfiltered terror, raw and animalistic, the kind that made even the most hardened boardroom veterans freeze in place. A boy, maybe 8, had crumpled to the floor outside the executive conference room, fists clenched, chest-heaving, face red from the force of his own voice. A nervous-looking assistant hovered nearby, trying and failing to soothe him with empty words and outstretched hands. But the boy, Leo, though Mark didn't know that yet, was beyond words. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the echo of voices too sharp, the towering windows, the humming printers, the constant buzz of tension in the air, it was too much, and everyone could feel it. Except no one moved. No one. Except the janitor. Mark didn't rush. He didn't speak. He didn't ask permission. He simply reached into the pocket of his utility apron and pulled out a nearly empty bottle of glass cleaner. And then, quietly, carefully, he turned it upside down and blew. A bubble. Tiny, iridescent, imperfect. It wobbled out of the nozzle like a secret and drifted into the artificial air, catching the harsh light in a shimmer of blue and violet. The boy froze. His scream died mid-breath. His eyes tracked the floating orb like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. And when the bubble popped with a soft kiss of silence, the child let out a shaky breath and stopped crying. The assistant blinked. So did everyone else. Mark crouched beside the boy, careful not to touch him, and blew another, then another. 3 bubbles. That's all it took. The boy stared at the janitor, eyes wide. His fingers, previously clawed into fists, relaxed ever so slightly. His breathing slowed. And that's when she appeared. Arden Lancaster stood in the hallway framed by glass and power. Her heels had stopped clicking. Her arms were folded, her jaw set. Her assistant had paged her from the meeting. Something about her son. Something about a meltdown. Something urgent. But Arden hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to find her son, her brilliant, troubled, beautiful son, kneeling quietly on the hallway floor, entranced by a bottle of glass cleaner and a man in a faded blue uniform. And she definitely hadn't expected to see Leo reach out and take that man's hand. For a moment, no one spoke, and then Arden's voice, sharp as ever, sliced through the stillness. "What do you think you're doing?" Mark stood slowly. He didn't release the boy's hand. Leo held on too tightly. "I was just trying to help, Mark," said his voice low and calm. "You're not qualified to help," she snapped. Her assistant stepped forward. "Miss Lancaster." "I take him," Arden said, nodding at the boy. "Get him to the private room on 38. Now." But Leo didn't move. His small hand clung to Mark's. Arden's gaze dropped just for a second and her voice faltered. "Leo, come with Mommy." Leo shook his head. The janitor, she didn't even know his name, crouched again and whispered something. She couldn't hear what it was, but she saw the boy look at him, and then at her. He let go of Mark's hand. Arden's shoulders dropped a fraction as the assistant carefully led Leo away. Mark remained kneeling, staring down at the popped bubble on the floor. When he rose, Arden's eyes locked onto his. They were gray-blue, tired, not defiant, not ashamed, just steady. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mark Dawson. I assume you're contracted through facilities." "Yes, ma'am." She paused. "Finish mopping this floor, then report to security." Mark nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't flinch. He didn't explain. He just went back to his mop, moving with the same quiet grace he always had. Arden turned heels, clicking once more. But something in her chest twisted as she walked away, because for the first time in months, maybe years, her son had reached out for someone. And it wasn't her. The security office smelled like old coffee and wet carpet. Mark sat on a worn plastic chair in the corner, hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't cuffed. He wasn't under arrest. But he might as well have been. The way the assistant manager glared at him from behind the desk felt like an accusation in itself. Across the room, two security guards whispered to each other behind a cracked monitor. One of them kept glancing back at Mark like he might explode or run. But Mark didn't move. He'd been still for years. A heavy-set man with thinning hair and an ill-fitting blazer finally broke the silence. "Dawson, right, Mark Dawson." "Yes, sir." The man sniffed, flipping through a few papers with more drama than necessary. "Facilities contract says you've been here 8 months. No complaints until now." Mark gave a polite nod. "You were told to avoid executive floors unless scheduled. You're assigned to floors 19 through 35. So, what were you doing?" "On 37, I was filling in," Mark said simply. "The regular janitor for that level called out sick. Dispatch sent me up." "Convenient," the man muttered. "And the CEO's son just happened to be there." Mark stayed silent. There were things worth explaining. And then there were moments best left to speak for themselves. The man leaned forward, folding his hands. "Mr. Dawson, do you realize the liability here? You approached the child of a major executive without clearance. What if something had gone wrong? What if she files a formal complaint?" Mark met his eyes, voice calm. "I didn't touch the boy. I just blew a bubble." The man stared. Then, as if that explanation was too ridiculous to bother with, he waved a hand. "You'll be written up. We'll see if facilities keeps you on." "Wait here." The door opened behind him. Sophie Chen stepped in. She didn't knock, didn't wait to be acknowledged. She walked in like she belonged in every room she entered because she usually did. Sophie, the manager, said, surprised, "You didn't need to come down here." "I did," she replied, "and you can go. I'll take it from here, but HR oversight. Contracted staff are under my jurisdiction. Please." The man hesitated, then stood and shuffled out his ego, bruised but still intact. Sophie waited for the door to close before turning to Mark. She didn't sit. She just stood across from him, her arms crossed not out of hostility but thoughtfulness, studying him. "I saw the report," she said. "Then I asked for your file." Mark said nothing. She held up a thin folder. "There's almost nothing in here. No education history, no references. Just a note that you declined to provide prior employment verification." She raised an eyebrow. "You're not who you say you are you?" Mark let out a quiet breath. "I never said who I was. I just took the job." "Right." Sophie's voice softened. "That kid, Leo. He's not easy. Arden's tried half the specialists in Boston, and he reached for you, like he's known you for years." Mark looked down at the floor. It wasn't anything. He just needed something simple, something quiet. "Glass cleaner and bubbles," she asked. His mouth lifted just barely. Kids don't care what it's called. They care how it feels. Sophie was quiet for a beat. "I used to teach," she said finally. "Special education. Before HR. I know what I saw, and what I saw upstairs wasn't an accident." She paused, then stepped closer. I don't know what happened to you, but I think you've been helping people a lot longer than you've been mopping floors. Mark's throat tightened. It had been a long time since someone said anything like that without pity. Then Sophie did something he didn't expect. She pulled out a folded paper from her coat and laid it on the desk in front of him. It was a form. Legal, a notice of petition. Family Services has an amnesty window this quarter, she said. You can file for reevaluation, for visitation, maybe more. Mark didn't reach for the paper. He stared at it like it was a ghost. How do you know about Emma? He asked. I didn't, Sophie replied gently. But I do now. Mark leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment. Then he told her. He told her about the night the car slid on black ice, about the hospital, about the silence that came after, how he stopped working, stopped speaking, stopped everything except showing up to the custody hearings where his grief made him look unstable. They gave Emma to his in-laws, said it was best. He didn't fight. He had nothing left to fight with. I see her twice a month, he said quietly. Supervised. I bring art supplies. She always draws bubbles. Sophie didn't speak. Mark looked up, eyes suddenly sharp. Don't tell Arden. I won't. She thinks I'm a janitor. You are, Sophie said, smiling. You just used to be more. Mark looked down at the petition. His fingers brushed the edge of the paper but didn't pick it up. Then the intercom buzzed. HR, a voice said, Ms. Lancaster is requesting the presence of Mark Dawson on 37. Immediately. Sophie stared at the speaker, then back at Mark. Well, she said sounds like you've got another appointment. Mark stood slowly. Still didn't touch the paper. But just before he left the room, he turned back to Sophie. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she replied. You're heading back into the lion's den. Mark gave a small smile. I've been in worse. The 37th floor was quiet. Too quiet. Mark Dawson stepped off the elevator with the wariness of a man who'd learned the hard way that silence never meant peace. He moved slowly, pushing his utility cart out of habit, though it had already been emptied and wiped down. His blue uniform was still damp from the morning's mop water. His shoes squeaked faintly against the tile. Across the floor beyond the glass conference rooms and minimalist hallways, the frosted door of the executive suite stood slightly ajar. Someone was waiting. Mark knocked lightly. Once. Come in, said the voice inside. Controlled. Crisp, but not quite as cold as before. He entered. The office was large and sunlit, wrapped in glass with a view of downtown Boston that seemed to float in the clouds. The furniture was modern, pristine, like something out of a design catalog. But the room's focal point wasn't the skyline. It was the small figure curled on a low couch near the window, Leo Lancaster. The boy was scribbling quietly in a notebook. His movements were tight, repetitive, but focused. He didn't look up. Across the room, Arden Lancaster stood behind her desk. She wasn't seated. Arden never seemed to sit. She was a woman who lived in motion, every gesture precise, every word premeditated. Today, though, there was something else. Something flickering behind the polish. She didn't waste time. My son, she said, nodding toward the couch, hasn't reacted to anyone like that in ever. Not therapists, not teachers, not family. Mark said nothing. She circled the desk and folded her arms, observing him with that same calculating expression she gave quarterly projections and merger proposals. What did you say to him? She asked. I didn't, Mark replied. I didn't say anything. Exactly. She paced once, then stopped near the edge of the couch, lowering her voice as if afraid to wake something delicate. He responded to your stillness. You weren't trying to fix him. You just let him be. Mark's gaze shifted briefly to the boy who was now drawing circles, dozens of them swirling across the page like tiny ripples on a pond. I've seen that before, Mark said quietly. Arden looked back at him. Where? He hesitated. Then, in children who've had to build entire worlds inside their heads. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones listening hardest. She studied him for a moment longer, then stepped closer. "I want to offer you something," she said. "Temporarily." Mark blinked. "An offer?" "I'm not asking you to be a therapist," Arden clarified quickly as if the thought offended her. "I want you to be here. Just here. When Leo is. In this space. I've moved one of the HR rooms next door, converted it. He seems calmer when you're near." Mark exhaled slowly. "I'm not trained anymore." She raised an eyebrow. "You didn't seem to need training yesterday." He shook his head. "I'm not the same person I was back then." "No one is," she replied. "That's not the point." He looked down at the floor, then back at her. "This isn't a promotion," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's trust." They stood there a moment, two people with nothing in common and yet strangely tethered by the fragile calm of the child in the corner. Finally, Mark nodded once. "I'll try," he said, "but I'm not promising results." Arden offered the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her, just a slight lift at the corner of her mouth. "I don't want results," she said. "I want my son to stop screaming every morning." She turned back to her desk and tapped a few keys on her tablet. "You'll be contracted through HR with adjusted hours. Sophie is aware. The room's ready. And Mark." He paused in the doorway. "Don't blow bubbles in the boardroom." That time he almost smiled. The converted HR room was small and undecorated, just a beanbag, a low table, a few storage bins. But it was quiet, warm, safe. Leo sat on the floor with his sketch pad. Mark took a seat on the opposite side of the room, not too close, just present. He didn't speak, didn't interfere. He waited. Minutes passed. 10, maybe 15. Then, without warning, Leo got up, walked over, and set the sketch pad in Mark's lap. It was a drawing of bubbles, dozens of them, floating, overlapping, some popping midair, and in the bottom corner a small stick figure holding the bubble wand. Mark traced a finger along the edge of the page. He'd seen thousands of these before, from children grasping at the world with pictures when words felt like storms. But this one wasn't about escape. It was about connection. He looked up, but Leo had already returned to his corner, back to his own rhythm content. And in that still moment, Mark Dawson, janitor father, almost forgotten man, realized something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Purpose. Not ambition, not redemption, just purpose. Back in her office, Arden watched through the frosted glass arms folded. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but she felt it. And for the first time in months, the tightness in her chest loosened. By the third morning, the room didn't feel like a leftover office anymore. It had changed. Not in the way that decorators or therapists might notice no sensory walls or white noise machines. Just small things. Quiet things. A soft gray rug that muffled footsteps. A stack of sketch pads on the shelf that Leo had started stacking and organizing by color. And Mark Dawson, always early, always quiet, already sitting cross-legged on the floor before the boy even arrived. The janitor had become part of the routine now. Leo entered each day with the same careful steps, like someone stepping into water and hoping it wasn't too cold. But when he saw Mark, he relaxed shoulders, lowering hands, unclenching. Some days he'd hand over a marker before saying a word. Other days he'd drop a ball in Mark's lap and wait for him to roll it back. Mark never pushed. He never asked for words or eye contact or anything beyond what Leo offered. He simply matched the boy's rhythm. Sometimes it was sitting in silence. Sometimes it was tracing circles on the carpet until Leo took over. And sometimes it was bubbles. Mark had refilled the old bottle with nothing more than water and a drop of dish soap. He'd removed the label, taped a small smiley face to the side. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't strategy. It was just magic, the way a bubble caught the light. Leo never laughed out loud, not yet. But he'd follow the bubbles with a half smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. as if something inside him wanted to be louder, but wasn't quite ready. And Mark understood that feeling more than anyone. Arden Lancaster didn't understand what she was watching. Every afternoon she passed the observation window. At first it had been curiosity, then confusion. Now, something closer to fascination. Mark never did anything impressive. He didn't sing. He didn't clap or play games or wave flashcards like the specialists had, but every day her son sat closer to him, stayed longer, drew more, calmed faster. And every time Leo whispered a new sound, a syllable, a hum, a soft repetition, Arden found herself pausing in her tracks. She didn't want to admit it, but she had started planning her meetings around those moments. Not that she said anything, of course. Arden wasn't the type to comment on emotion. She led through results, not feelings. Feelings were messy, unquantifiable, unreliable. But this, whatever this was becoming harder to ignore, especially when the whispers started. Whispers from her staff. That janitor, what's his deal? I think the CEO's kid is obsessed with him. Did you see how he got Leo to stop rocking just by tapping his fingers? Some were curious, others suspicious, a few outright judgmental. But Arden didn't care. Not yet. That Thursday morning, something shifted. Leo walked in carrying his sketchpad. It was different from the others. Spiral-bound. Red cover. He handed it to Mark, then walked to the corner and sat down without a word. Mark opened the pad slowly. Inside were pages, dozens of them, each one filled with bubbles. Some small, some massive. Some full of color, others shaded in charcoal. But in the center of every page was the same stick figure, a man in a blue shirt. Mark didn't speak, but something in his chest tightened, and for a moment he had to blink harder than usual. Leo was watching him. The boy didn't smile, but he was waiting, expecting something. Mark cleared his throat and turned the sketchpad around, pointing to the figure. "This is me." Leo didn't answer, but he slid his fingers together twice in imitation of the motion Mark used to snap open the wand before blowing a bubble. It wasn't just acknowledgement. It was connection. Later that afternoon, while Mark was wiping down the kitchenette in the HR lounge, Sophie Chen approached him. She didn't carry a clipboard, no file, just a coffee in hand and a look that said she wasn't here for small talk. "He's opened up more in 5 days than he has in 5 years, she said. "You're doing something right." "I'm just being here," Mark replied. Sophie leaned against the counter. "You know they're talking, right? People upstairs, wondering why a janitor's babysitting the CEO's son." Mark kept wiping. "Let them talk." "I will," Sophie said, then added softer, "But they won't, forever." She paused, sipping her coffee. "You ever think about doing this again?" For real, Mark stopped. His hand hovered over the counter. "I used to," he said, "back when I thought I could fix things." Sophie's voice was kind. "You're not fixing anything. You're just showing up." Mark looked away. "That's what scares me." That night, as he left the building, Mark passed by the reflective glass wall on the ground floor and saw himself. Same uniform, same mop bucket, same slouched posture. But something was different. In the reflection, for just a moment, he imagined the little stick figure from Leo's drawing standing beneath a sky full of bubbles holding a wand like it mattered. And for the first time in years, he didn't look away. He stood there staring at the man he used to be. Maybe not broken, just waiting. Waiting for someone to draw him back into the picture. Arden Lancaster rarely hesitated. In boardrooms she commanded without flinching. In negotiations she cut through noise like a scalpel. But that Friday afternoon, standing in her glass-walled office with a printed file folder trembling slightly in her hands, hesitation crept in like an unwelcome draft. Mark Dawson. It wasn't even his real personnel file. Just a fragment barebones. A contract employee, no degree listed, no license, no recent work history beyond janitorial services. No red flags. But also, No clarity. Arden didn't like ambiguity. That was why she had sent a quiet internal request to IT. Not a full background check, just deeper context. Context, she reasoned, was part of leadership. And now with the unofficial report open on her desk, she was staring at a past she hadn't expected. A decade ago, Mark Dawson had been a respected behavior interventionist at one of the most renowned early childhood neurodevelopment centers in the state. Advanced certifications, published research, glowing letters from colleagues and grateful families, a rising name, until the accident. Until his wife died in a highway crash that made the local news for 3 days straight. He'd been driving. It wasn't his fault black ice failed brakes, but that hadn't stopped the whispers, or the collapse that followed. He left the field, the job, the city, and then 4 months later, custody of his daughter was transferred to the maternal grandparents. No further record of employment, no social presence, just silence. Arden's hand gripped the edge of the desk. She wasn't sure what disturbed her more, that the janitor she'd trusted with her son was hiding something, or that what he'd been hiding wasn't scandal but pain. That evening, Mark was in the garage wiping down the company van used for supply runs. Not because it was his job, he'd finished his shift an hour earlier, but because staying busy felt safer than going home to an empty studio with peeling paint and a fridge that held mostly bottled water and applesauce. The tap of high heels on concrete startled him. He turned. Arden stood a few paces away, arms crossed, a thick folder in her hand. She didn't speak immediately. The echo of traffic filtered in from the street above, mixing with the hum of fluorescent lights. "I read it," she said finally. Mark knew what it meant. He didn't ask how she got it. He set the rag down carefully. "I figured you might. I had to know who I was letting near my son." He nodded once. No anger, no defense, just the truth he'd grown used to. People only care once they know what to be afraid of. "And now that you know," he asked. Arden hesitated. "He trusts you," she said. "More than he trusts me. That's not easy to admit." Mark didn't respond. She stepped closer, her voice lower, now steadier. "You worked with children like Leo. You were trained. You were gifted," they said. "I was married," Mark said quietly. "I was a father. I thought that was enough." Arden's jaw tightened. She didn't like how familiar that sentence felt. "I lost her in seconds," he added, "but it took me years to lose myself. That part was slower." Arden looked away. "You still see your daughter?" she asked. "Twice a month. Supervised. She doesn't talk much when I visit, but she draws." He smiled barely. Bubbles mostly. A pause stretched between them. Not cold, not tense, just full of things unsaid. "She used to have a bubble machine," he added. "Her mom bought it. Said it was like watching happiness float." Arden swallowed. "I don't know how to be what Leo needs." Mark looked at her, really looked. "Then stop trying to be something," he said. "Just be there." The next morning, Arden arrived early. Earlier than usual, before assistants, before emails, before the distractions of being Arden Lancaster CEO. She stepped into the observation hallway outside the therapy room, just in time to see Mark sitting on the floor, his legs folded, arms resting on his knees. Leo was standing beside him, drawing on the window with a whiteboard marker. Simple shapes, lines, circles. And then, soft, barely audible, Leo spoke. "Buh. Buh." Mark didn't move, didn't praise, didn't interrupt. He just gently tapped his finger twice on the rug. Encouragement without pressure. Leo tried again. "Buh. Bo." Then pointed to the window. A bubble. Drawn in imperfect loops floating in the air. Arden pressed her hand to her chest without realizing it. Her throat clenched. It wasn't a sentence. It wasn't even a full word. But it was sound. Willingly given. Directed. Communication. She didn't cry. Arden Lancaster didn't cry. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to. That afternoon, Sophie found Mark sitting on the back steps of the building sipping bad coffee from a styrofoam cup. She sat beside him, tossing him a granola bar without asking. "You ever gonna file that petition I gave you?" she asked. Mark tapped the cup against his knee. Still thinking. Sophie leaned back. "You know you're not fooling anyone anymore, right? People are starting to notice." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're not just a janitor," she said. "Not to Leo. Not to Arden." Mark shook his head. "That's not the problem." "Then what?" as he looked at her eyes, tired but steady. "I'm not sure I remember how to let people believe in me again." Sophie stared at him for a long moment, then said, "That's the easy part." Mark tilted his head. "You just show up," she said, "and you don't leave." Mark exhaled, and for the first time in years it didn't feel heavy. It felt like something beginning. The room didn't look like much from the outside. An old HR office barely wider than a hallway, its fluorescent lights replaced by a single soft lamp in the corner. A faded rug stretched across the floor. 2 beanbags sat by a low table covered in paper markers and a few gently used toys. On the windowsill rested the bottle clear plastic filled with soapy water and taped with a crooked, smiley face. Inside, it was quiet, but not empty. Mark sat cross-legged on the rug, a sandwich in hand, slowly unwrapping the wax paper as if he were handling something sacred. Across from him, Leo was bent over a sheet of construction paper, pressing down hard with a blue crayon. He wasn't speaking, but his breathing was calm, focused. Outside the glass door, Arden stood still, watching. She didn't mean to linger. She hadn't even planned to come by. But something had drawn her feet down that hallway again, just like it had all week. And now, here she was, heels in hand, hair undone from the bun she always wore like armor barefoot, and uncertain in a way that felt entirely foreign to her. She wasn't CEO Arden Lancaster in this moment. She was just Leo's mom. Mark looked up and saw her. Their eyes met his steady, hers hesitant. Then with a small nod he motioned to the floor beside him. An invitation. She hesitated, not because she was unwilling, but because no one had invited her to sit down in a long time without expecting a pitch deck or a signature. Slowly, she stepped inside. She didn't ask where to sit. She just folded herself onto the rug across from Mark, mirroring his posture. The floor felt oddly grounding, far away from conference tables and polished leather chairs. Leo barely acknowledged her, but he didn't leave either. Mark offered her half a sandwich. She blinked. "Is that turkey and cheddar?" he replied. She took it, bit into it, chewed slowly. "I haven't eaten lunch on the floor since college," she murmured. Mark smirked. "It shows. You're sitting like your spine's afraid of being informal." She huffed a soft laugh, caught off guard. There was a long moment of silence. Not the awkward kind, just the kind where 2 people didn't need to fill the air with anything. Leo kept drawing, completely content. Arden watched him, then spoke quietly. "I tried everything you know. Occupational therapy, sensory integration, floor time, ABA. Nothing ever stuck. No one ever stayed." Mark nodded, because they were trying to change him. She looked over. "And you're not. I'm just showing up," he said. "That's enough. For now." There was a weight in her eyes, a guilt that didn't quite know how to name itself. "I keep thinking I'm doing everything wrong." Mark's voice softened. "You're here." Arden looked down. Her fingers fidgeted with the crust of her sandwich. "I used to think if I just worked hard enough, read enough parenting blogs, hired the best people, that I could fix this." Mark's gaze shifted toward Leo, who had started adding small stick figures to his drawing. One, tall one, shorter one, child-sized. "You don't fix children," Mark said gently. "You meet them." Arden's throat tightened. The rug beneath her knees suddenly felt like holy ground. She turned to Mark. "You said your daughter draws bubbles, too." He nodded. "Always has, even when she stopped talking to me." "What's her name?" "Emma." "Does she know?" What happened? She knows enough, he said. She remembers her mom. She remembers the way things used to be. But I don't think she blames me. His voice dropped lower. I think I blame me enough for both of us. Arden stared at him silent. And then something shifted in the room. Leo put down his crayon. He stood up, walked over to his mother, and without a word, gently placed the drawing in her lap. Arden looked at it. 3 stick figures, holding hands, standing under a sky full of imperfect, wobbly bubbles. Her hand flew to her mouth. Mark watched, but didn't speak. This moment wasn't his. Leo pointed to one of the figures, the one in the middle, and said softly, "Mama, smile." It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was clear. Arden's eyes filled instantly. She looked at Mark as if seeking permission to believe what she'd heard. He only nodded. Later that day, Mark sat alone on the back steps again, watching the sun dip behind the parking structure. His hands were folded, his back resting against the brick wall. The door creaked open. Arden stepped out, still barefoot, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word and sat beside him. They sipped in silence. Finally, she said, "Thank you. For today." Mark nodded. Then, quietly, she asked, "Do you miss her? Your wife?" Mark stared at the horizon. "Every day." Arden looked down. "I'm not sure I ever had anyone to miss." Mark turned to her. Then, maybe. Now's the time to let someone in. She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. Inside the building, in the small converted HR room, Leo sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing another bubble. This time, it had wings, and for the first time, it flew. The conference room on the 38th floor of Lancaster Industries was made of glass and ice-sleek panels, chrome chairs, a table long enough to seat power and pride at opposite ends. Arden Lancaster stood at the head, arms crossed, her eyes betraying the storm she kept bottled. Mark stood quietly off to the side, a clipboard in hand, though he wasn't using it for anything. He wasn't here to present. He was only invited because Arden had insisted firmly against the board's recommendation. Leo sat next to his mother, clutching a stuffed elephant Mark hadn't seen before. Its fabric was worn a tiny stitch on one ear, like someone had tried to hold it together a long time ago. Across the table board, members shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. At the center was Elliot Crane, slick gray hair, polished cufflinks, and a voice that could slice through reason. "We appreciate the progress Mr. Dawson has made with your son," Elliot began, barely nodding in Mark's direction. "But we must remember that this company is not a therapy center. We are a global brand." Arden's jaw tightened. Elliot continued. "Our new campaign, Voices Beyond Words, will showcase Lancaster Industries' commitment to inclusion and breakthrough innovation. Featuring Leo is not just inspiring, it's brilliant branding." Mark's spine stiffened. Arden leaned forward. "He's not a brand." "Of course not." Elliot smiled thinly. "He's a bridge, a symbol of progress. Imagine the message. Even a child without words can lead a global movement." The words fell like ice water over the room. Mark finally spoke. His voice was steady but sharp. "Children with autism aren't symbols. They're not bridges or movements. They're kids, vulnerable. And your campaign, however well-intentioned, isn't about Leo. It's about how he can serve you." Silence. Tense, coiled silence. Arden didn't say a word. Her eyes flicked to Leo, who was now drawing on the back of a company brochure with a crayon Mark had slipped him earlier. Elliot turned to Mark, voice condescending. "With respect, Mr. Dawson, you were hired to clean floors, not critique corporate messaging." Mark didn't flinch. "With respect, I was hired to stay invisible." But Leo saw me anyway. That struck something. A few heads turned. Someone in the back cleared their throat. Elliot waved a hand. "We're going to rehearse the speech now. Ms. Lancaster, please bring your son to the front." Arden hesitated. "He's not ready. We need a visual, Arden. A statement. He doesn't have to speak. He just needs to stand beside you." She stood slowly, heart tight in her chest. Mark's gaze met hers across the room, unspoken concern, a question, a plea. She looked away. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, touching Leo's hand. At first, he followed her willingly. He trusted her now at least enough to walk. But the moment they neared the front near the glaring lights and row of silent executives, his steps slowed. His fingers curled tighter around the elephant. His breathing grew fast and shallow. "Leo," she said softly. "It's okay. Just stand beside me, honey." But Leo's eyes darted from face to face. Every stare felt like a siren. Every shadow loomed like a trap. He shrank back, the elephant pressed to his chest. "Leo," she tried again, reaching for his shoulder. And then it cracked. "Mark," Leo's voice burst out loud and raw, slicing through the sterile air. The entire room froze. Arden's hand dropped to her side. Mark stepped forward on instinct but stopped himself at the edge of the glass wall. His heart hammered in his chest. Leo was crying, but not out of fear. His eyes were locked on Mark, and the word had come from somewhere deep, somewhere that had never dared to speak before. "Mark," he shouted again, tears streaming now. His body shook overwhelmed, and Mark moved. Past Arden, past the boardroom hierarchy, past the invisible lines that once kept him in the shadows. He knelt down. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered, holding out his arms. Leo ran to him, wrapping his small body around Mark's neck, sobbing into his shoulder. No one said a word. Elliot Crane stared, lips parted, unsure whether to speak or leave. A few board members slowly set down their papers. Sophie, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. And Arden. Arden crumbled. She sank into the nearest chair, her hand over her mouth, shoulders trembling. Her son had spoken his first word. Not mama. Not yes or no. Not even a sound he could echo. He had called out for someone he trusted. "Con toi," she whispered almost to herself. "Jan goi tenan e." Mark sat on the floor holding Leo like the world outside didn't exist. The boy's sobs slowly faded into hiccups and then into quiet breaths. His fingers found Mark's collar and his body relaxed. Only then did Mark look up. His eyes met Arden's. She was no longer the icy CEO who'd threatened to fire him in Chapter 1. She was a mother, grieving, amazed, and utterly undone. He didn't smile, but his gaze said everything. "I told you," it said, "he just needed someone who wouldn't walk away." And in that moment, the entire boardroom, all its power, money, and titles meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was that a boy had found his voice, and he had chosen love. Arden stood, slowly walked toward Mark and Leo, and with a trembling voice said, "He said your name." Mark nodded, once voice quiet but certain. "Yes," he said. And he meant it. The boardroom slowly emptied, but the silence lingered long after the footsteps faded. Outside the glass doors, the executives filed out in stunned quiet, murmuring behind cupped hands. Elliot Crane didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The moment had already stolen the script from his hands and rewritten it with something far more powerful, a child's voice, raw and unfiltered. Inside, Mark sat on the carpeted floor with Leo curled up in his lap, the boy's breath finally even and soft. The elephant plush lay beside them, forgotten but still near like a silent sentinel. One of Leo's small hands clutched the fabric of Mark's workshirt as if afraid that letting go would undo everything they'd just gained. Arden stood a few feet away, unmoving. She looked at her son. Really looked. Not with worry or calculation, not as a mother running scenarios in her head, but as a woman witnessing something sacred. Her arms hung loosely at her sides, but her fingers trembled. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, nearly swallowed by the room. "Has he ever held on like that to anyone?" Mark looked up, brushing a bit of hair from Leo's forehead. "No, not that I've seen. He didn't say it with pride. He said it like it hurt." Arden lowered herself slowly onto the floor knees, creaking beneath her tailored slacks. It wasn't graceful, but it was real. For once, she wasn't above anyone. She was just a mother, sitting on a rug beside a janitor and the child they both loved. Mark turned to her. "I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't," she said. "You saved him." A long pause stretched between them. Then Mark exhaled. "There were years. After Emma was taken from me, when I didn't speak to anyone. Not really. Just did what I had to do. My whole world became about staying close, just close enough to see her grow up, even if she didn't see me." Arden's eyes flicked toward him. "Emma's your daughter." He nodded. 8 years old. She used to draw me pictures every night before bed, called them her bubble wishes. She couldn't blow bubbles yet, so she drew them instead. After her mom passed, she stopped drawing, and I stopped being allowed to visit. Arden's throat tightened. Mark glanced down at Leo. "When your son looked at me that first morning, it wasn't just about calming him. It was about remembering what it felt like to be needed. Not pitied, not avoided, just needed." The room fell into silence again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was fuller, warmer, like the kind that filled a home late at night when no one needed to talk because everyone knew they were safe. Leo stirred slightly, shifting closer into Mark's chest. Arden watched, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a tissue. She handed it to Mark without a word. He accepted it with a small nod of gratitude. Then she said something that surprised even herself. "I don't think I've ever said thank you," and meant it. Mark looked at her, his expression unreadable at first. Then something soft flickered in his eyes. "Try it," he said. "Might surprise you." She huffed a small laugh. "You're not exactly easy to categorize, you know." "Good," he replied. "Categories don't hug back." Arden turned her gaze to Leo. "I've spent so long trying to control everything, fix every crack before it spreads, patch every flaw before anyone notices. But I never saw it. What he really needed wasn't control or order." She trailed off. It was presence Mark finished for her. They sat like that for several minutes. Quiet, present. The three of them sharing a small circle of carpet in a world that otherwise spun too fast. Then, softly, Mark spoke. "You know, the funny thing about therapy is, it's not about teaching the child how to speak. It's about learning how to listen in ways most people never do." Arden's eyes shimmered. "So what is he trying to say now?" Mark looked at Leo, who had now fallen asleep against him. "He's saying, I trust you not to let go." Arden leaned her back against the glass wall and let her eyes close briefly. She hadn't done that in years, inhaled deeply and let herself feel the weight of the moment without trying to outrun it. When she opened them again, Mark was watching her. Not judgmentally, just watching. She cleared her throat. "There's something I'd like to do. For you." "I don't need anything," he said quickly, almost reflexively. "It's not about need," she replied. "It's about what's right." He hesitated. "What do you mean?" Arden reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope. "I had Sophie draft this. It's an application to the Family Court's Joint Custody Support Initiative. We'll back you, our legal team, our name, whatever it takes." Mark stared at the envelope. "Why would you do that for me?" Her voice wavered just a little. "Because I know what it's like to live beside someone you love and not know how to reach them. Because I owe you more than a thank you. And because Leo already calls you what most people spend a lifetime searching for." Mark didn't answer right away. He gently adjusted Leo in his arms, brushing the boy's cheek with the back of his hand. Then, finally, he looked at her and said, "You're not as cold as people think." Arden smirked. "Don't ruin my reputation." They both chuckled low and easy like two people who hadn't laughed in a very long time. As the overhead lights dimmed on their own timer, casting the room in amber glow, Arden did something she hadn't done with another adult in years. She reached out her hand. Mark looked at it. Then slowly he placed his hand in hers, and neither of them let go. Her voice barely a whisper. Now Arden said, "I need you. Not just for Leo." And for once Mark didn't hide. He didn't deflect. He simply said, "I'm not going anywhere." The sky over Boston that afternoon was pale and tender, brushed with streaks of gold and soft gray. It was the kind of sky that looked like it was holding its breath suspended between rain and sunlight, sorrow and promise. Mark Dawson stood on the sidewalk outside a modest townhouse in Dorchester, the official custody documents folded tightly in his hand like a lifeline. Beside him, Arden adjusted her coat collar against the wind. She didn't say anything, she just stood there, her presence quiet but strong. Inside that house was his little girl, Emma. 8 years old now, 1,000 days older since the last time he'd held her. 1,000 nights he'd whispered goodnight to a photograph instead of a heartbeat. He turned to Arden. "You sure about this?" She met his eyes. "Are you?" Mark gave a soft exhale. "Not even close." He rang the bell. A long moment passed, and then the door opened just a crack. A woman in her 60s peeked through. Mrs. Landry, the court-appointed guardian. She glanced at Mark, then at Arden, who stood poised in quiet authority. "Mr. Dawson," the woman said. "They told me you might come." "Is she okay?" Mark asked, voice barely holding steady. Mrs. Landry nodded. "She's quiet today. More quiet than usual. Been asking questions she doesn't know how to ask." Mark's chest tightened. "Can I see her?" Another pause. Then the door opened wider. In the back room, Mrs. Landry said softly, "She's drawing." Mark stepped inside. Every nerve in his body felt on fire, burning with memory, fear, hope, and a kind of longing that only fathers understand when they've gone too long without hearing their child's voice. He walked slowly down the narrow hallway. The house smelled like lavender and pencil shavings. Every step felt like walking into a place he used to belong to, but didn't anymore. Then he saw her. Emma sat cross-legged on the carpet, a colored pencil in each hand, a mess of papers scattered around her like petals. She wore a yellow hoodie 2 sizes too big, and her hair was pulled into a loose braid that kept falling over her shoulder. Mark's breath caught in his throat. She hadn't changed, and she had changed completely. She looked up, and for a second neither of them moved. Then Mark crouched down, not too close. Not yet. His voice cracked as he said, "Hey there, bubble girl." Her eyes widened. The pencil dropped from her fingers. "I still have your drawings," he said. "The ones with the pink and purple bubbles, I kept every single one." Emma blinked. Her lips parted slightly. Then, without warning, she stood and walked over, not running, not lunging, but with the deliberate steps of someone who needed to be sure. Mark didn't reach for her. He waited. She stopped in front of him so close he could see the tiny flecks of green in her hazel eyes. Her small hand rose slowly and touched the stubble on his chin. "You got old," she whispered. Mark laughed. It broke something in him and healed something else. "Yeah," he said, tears threatening. "It happens when you miss someone every single day." Emma's lower lip trembled. And then she hugged him. Not a hesitant hug. A full-body, melt-into-you hug, the kind children give when they stop being afraid and remember what safety feels like. Mark wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, the sound of her heart against his. "I'm here, sweet pea," he whispered. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere this time." From the doorway, Arden watched with her arms folded and her eyes shining. Leo stood beside her, holding his plush elephant in one hand and a small object in the other, his bubble wand. He stepped into the room. Emma noticed him and pulled back from her father's arms. Mark turned as Leo walked up to Emma and offered the bubble wand with a quiet kind of ceremony. Emma took it curious. "What's this?" Leo didn't speak. He just blew gently and a single shimmering bubble floated between them. Emma's face lit up. "Cool," she whispered. Mark smiled, watching the exchange like it was the most natural miracle in the world. "Leo doesn't talk much either," he said gently, "but he sees everything. And he remembers kindness." Emma turned to Leo and, after a pause, extended her hand. "I'm Emma." Leo looked to Mark, who nodded softly. Then the boy reached out and shook her hand. Arden walked into the room, fully now sitting cross-legged beside them. She didn't try to take control of the moment. She just let it bloom. Emma looked at her curiously. "Are you a doctor?" "No," Arden replied with a smile. "I'm a friend of your dad's." Emma tilted her head. "You don't look like his friend." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "She looks fancy," Emma said, wrinkling her nose. Arden laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." Emma turned to her father. "Did you bring me?" Mark nodded. "With her help." Emma looked at Arden again, a new layer of understanding flickering across her face. "Thank you for bringing my dad." "You're welcome," Arden said softly. There was a pause, the kind of pause that lets something new begin. Then Emma looked down at the paper in her lap. "Can I draw us now?" Mark asked, surprised. "Yeah, you and me. And them," she said, pointing to Arden and Leo. Mark swallowed hard. "I'd love that." And so she did. With fierce concentration, Emma began sketching a picture of 4 figures under a sky full of floating bubbles. Each bubble had a smile inside it. Mark watched her draw, unable to stop the tears that slid down his face. It wasn't a family photo, but it was a family. A new one. Fragile forming and full of hope. As Emma shaded in a bright yellow sun, she looked up at Arden and asked, "Are you going to be in our picture forever, too?" Arden blinked, and then, for once, she didn't think. She just nodded and said, "I hope so." The grand atrium of Lancaster Industries had never looked more alive. Where sterile marble once echoed only the footsteps of executives and board members, it now pulsed with music light and something rarer hope. Soft banners lined the walls, each bearing the campaign's title in warm, open script, "Voices Beyond Words." Below them, children played with sensory-friendly toys. Parents mingled in cautious but curious circles. Therapists, advocates, and journalists hovered with clipboards and cameras. But at the center of it all stood a small platform. And on it, Leo. 8 years old, dressed in a simple navy sweater and khaki pants, his hands clutched tightly around a sheet of construction paper crinkled at the corners from constant holding. He stood beside Arden and Mark, who flanked him like 2 lighthouses against the tide of watching eyes. The crowd quieted. Someone tapped the microphone. The hush deepened, and then Arden stepped forward. Her heels clicked once against the wood before she paused, letting the silence bloom. When she spoke, her voice wasn't the clipped, polished tone of a CEO, but softer, slower, as if every word had been chosen by her heart before her lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I used to believe that leadership was about control, about efficiency, deliverables, numbers." A soft rustle in the audience, familiar faces from the board, others from the press. "I was wrong," she continued, "because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do as a leader or as a mother is to stop talking and start listening." She turned slightly, her eyes falling on Leo. "My son doesn't speak much. But this," she gestured toward the drawing in his hands, "this is his voice." Leo looked up at her. Mark gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, grounding him. Arden knelt beside her son. "Would you like to show them?" Leo nodded once. His movements were small but deliberate as he turned toward the crowd and slowly raised the paper above his head. Gasps rippled through the room, not loud, but unmistakable. Whispers, camera shutters. The image on the paper was a drawing, childlike but deeply felt. 3 figures stood in the center, a man, a woman, and a child. Above them, swirls of floating soap bubbles danced in a sky painted with uneven strokes of blue and yellow. But it wasn't the picture that stopped hearts, it was the names scrawled beneath each figure. Dad, Mom, me. The audience stilled. Mark felt his breath catch. Arden blinked rapidly, her mouth parting just slightly. And Leo. Leo simply held the picture steady, his eyes darting to his parents for reassurance, but his hands never trembling. The room remained hushed until one child in the audience clapped once, then another. Then the whole room rose to its feet. A standing ovation, not for a speech, not for a product launch, but for a moment of connection. Arden returned to the microphone, her voice now laced with emotion. When we started this campaign, we said it was about helping children speak. But today, I realize something else. This isn't about giving voices. She glanced toward Leo. It's about honoring them, even the ones we can't always hear. Mark stepped forward now, his presence unassuming but deeply felt. He looked out at the crowd, then back at Leo, then spoke with a quiet conviction that carried far. Every child is telling us something, he said. Sometimes with words, sometimes with drawings, or gestures, or silence. But they are always speaking. He glanced at Arden, then at Leo, then added, "The real question is, are we listening?" There was no more applause, just stillness, the kind of silence that meant something had landed deep. As the event wrapped up, Arden and Mark guided Leo off stage. The crowd gently parted, many reaching out with soft smiles and moist eyes, not wanting to disturb the moment, but needing to acknowledge it. In the green room behind the atrium, away from the flashing lights and handshakes, Leo sat cross-legged on a sofa, clutching a juice box. Emma was beside him now, showing him how to pop the straw without squirting the drink. She had a new drawing in her lap, this one featuring 4 stick figures and a large, oddly shaped dog labeled Bubble. Mark leaned against the far wall watching them. His hands were tucked into his pockets, but his shoulders were relaxed for the first time in years. Arden sat beside him, their arms nearly touching. "You were incredible," Mark said quietly. "I just told the truth," Arden replied, voice low. "Yeah, well." He turned to her. "You told it beautifully." Arden looked down, then up at him. "There was a time I didn't think I could ever stand on a stage and say the word mother without flinching." Mark didn't respond immediately. He waited. She looked at Leo. But when he drew that picture, with me in it, I felt it, felt what Arden turned to him fully. Her voice dropped to a whisper, that I was enough. For him. Mark's eyes softened. "You've always been enough." She held his gaze. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. He didn't hesitate. "I don't know what this is yet," she said, "but I don't want to do it alone anymore." Mark squeezed her hand. "You're not." Silence again, but a good one. A safe one. Then Leo stood up, toddled over, and tugged at Arden's sleeve. She looked down. He held up the drawing again. "Keep it," he said. Arden's breath caught. It was only 2 words, but they landed like a thunderclap. She knelt and took the paper, gently holding it like it was made of glass. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Leo turned to Mark. "Daddy?" Happy Mark knelt beside him, tears welling. "Yeah, buddy, I really am." And then, for the first time, Arden didn't think, didn't analyze, didn't calculate. She just leaned in and kissed Mark softly on the lips. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And Leo smiled. In that quiet green room surrounded by crumpled juice boxes and crayon drawings, 4 lives found their way into something that looked suspiciously like family. Outside the window, a child blew soap bubbles into the spring air. Inside, Mark looked at Arden and whispered, This is what healing looks like." The old house at the edge of Sycamore Hill was never supposed to be anything more than a temporary stop. When Mark first moved in with Leo, the sagging porch, creaky floors, and mismatched light fixtures felt like a shelter, not a home. It was just a roof, a place to rest between janitor shifts and speech therapy appointments, the kind of house where dreams came to pause, not to bloom. But this morning, it felt different. The sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, warm and golden, dancing across the hardwood. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and toast. Somewhere in the living room a kettle whistled, and Leo was humming a quiet, tuneless melody that only made sense to him. Mark stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, just watching. Leo sat cross-legged on the floor, building a tall, lopsided tower out of blocks. Each one was a different color, etched with letters. He would stack them carefully, tongue between his lips, and then whisper something under his breath before placing the next. Mark didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. These days he understood that silence could be sacred. Behind him, footsteps padded across the hall. Bare feet, slippers. And then a familiar voice, still soft from sleep. "He's been up since 6, Arden murmured, wrapping her arms around Mark's waist from behind. He wanted to build a tower, all the way to the clouds. Mark smiled. "I used to think he'd never speak. I used to think I'd never feel safe in a place like this." They stood there for a moment, just breathing. The world beyond their doorstep still buzzed campaigns to run investors, to charm articles still trending about the Lancaster CEO who changed everything. But here in this quiet kitchen there were no meetings, no scripts, just 3 people learning how to belong. They didn't call it family. Not yet, but it was starting to feel like one. Later that afternoon, the backyard filled with laughter, Emma's bright and unfiltered as she chased Leo between the trees. The grass had grown thick and wild since spring arrived, dotted with wildflowers Arden had sworn weren't intentional, but Mark suspected she'd planted anyway. A faded hammock stretched between 2 oaks. A small picnic spread on a wool blanket, peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, sparkling water in plastic cups. Sophie sat under a parasol chair sipping iced tea and pretending not to be emotional every time Leo said a full sentence. "You know," she said to Mark, "he's telling knock-knock jokes now. Yesterday, he said, 'Knock, knock.' I said, 'Who's there?' And he said, 'Leo.' I said, 'Leo, who?' And he just grinned and said, 'Leo, me.'" Mark chuckled. "He's been testing that one all week. Kid's got comedic timing," Sophie said, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "Just like his dad." Mark paused, heart caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. "I don't know what I did to deserve this." "You didn't have to do anything," Sophie said. "You just had to stay." That night, as twilight fell and fireflies flickered like tiny lanterns, Arden brought out the gift. A small wooden box, simple, hand-carved with a delicate brass latch. Leo reached for it first. He sat cross-legged on the grass, the hem of his pajamas brushing the earth. Carefully he opened it. Inside, a single worn paintbrush, a small vial of bubble solution, and a note written in Arden's handwriting. "To Leo May, your voice never be measured by volume, but by the light it brings." He touched the bubble wand reverently, then looked up at Arden. "Blow with me," he asked. And she did. They dipped the wand into the solution, and together they blew into the dusk. Bubbles shimmered into the air, some big, some small, all iridescent, all drifting toward the stars like tiny prayers. Arden leaned toward Mark. "He told me yesterday," she said, "that every bubble has a word inside it. You can't hear it, but you can feel it." Mark turned to her. "What did today's bubbles say?" She looked up at the drifting orbs and smiled. They said, "Home." Later, when Leo was tucked into bed, cheeks, rosy hair tousled from play, Mark and Arden lingered at the doorway. The nightlight cast a soft glow over the room paintings taped to the wall, books scattered on the shelf, the wooden box on the bedside table. Arden slipped her hand into Mark's. "Can I tell you something?" she whispered. He turned to her. "Always." "I was scared," she admitted, "of being someone's mom, of loving like this, of not being enough." "You are," Mark said. "Not because you fixed everything, but because you stayed through it." She looked at him, eyes shining. "I want to build something with you, Mark. Not a company, not a campaign, just this, us." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Then let's do it, one quiet moment at a time." And in that moment, they didn't need fanfare, not a headline, not a speech, just the whisper of a child's breath in the next room and the knowledge that healing had found a place to land, a place called understood. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't shouted, they're whispered, through crayons, through bubbles, through a child who finally says, "I'm home." And maybe, just maybe, home isn't built with walls or windows. Maybe it's built with patience, with second chances, with a single bubble drifting through the air carrying a word the heart finally understands. If this story touched you, I'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Are you from a small town, a big city, or maybe somewhere in between, just like Mark and Leo? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Was there a moment that made you pause? A line that stayed with you? And if stories like these speak to your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing family of listeners who believe in healing hope and the quiet power of love. Until next time. Thank you for spending this moment with us. Stay kind, stay curious, and remember sometimes the smallest voices tell the biggest stories.